In a digital world where social media and online content is easily accessible, it is becoming ever more important to think about online racism and the impact it has on people of color. What is online racism? Are there ways to mitigate the exposure? And what is the effect of online racism on people's mental health? And are there interventions or strategies that therapists can develop to support clients of color exposed to online racism? Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Tsen. We have Dr. Keum as our guest today. He is an assistant professor at the Department of Social Welfare at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. As a social justice-oriented scientist practitioner, Dr. Keum has developed a career committed to investigating and addressing discrimination and oppression as social determinants of health and mental health disparities. His research examines online racism, intersectionality in Asian American mental health, multicultural and social justice-oriented psychotherapy, and culturally valid and informed psychometrics. As a Korean American and Korean Canadian, Dr. Keum will be sharing his ideas on ways to address online racism and social media competence for psychologists. Dr. Keum, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me today. Really great to be here.
How did you get into this work? Why don't you share with us your journey, especially getting into the research of online racism?
Yeah, this is definitely a loaded question because there's a lot that goes into, reflecting back on, how I began on this journey. So, as a Korean American and then also with roots in, from a Korean immigrant household growing up in Canada, psychology wasn't something that was right in front of me, right? Growing up, it wasn't until college I heard something about psychology. And so in a typical kind of immigrant household, across the diverse Asian communities, there is, a lot of expectation for one to kind of, excel professionally. And those can be seen in kind of obtaining jobs as, doctors, lawyers, engineers that, have kind of seen as higher stature, right, jobs in our society. And I think a lot of the immigrant household, coming over, trying to be successful, trying to make sure that, we go forward and we can put the roof over our head, we have money, we have foundation. But naturally, they might be really inclined to identify with career prospects in those regards. And, my family wasn't any different. So, I was expected to really go for the doctors, lawyers, and the engineers. And then I entered my college with a pre-med degree, actually. And so I was like, I'm going to major in anatomy. I'm going to be a doctor. But as I was going through that process, I just felt like this was not the experience that I wanted. There was a lot of discrepancy in terms of how I viewed the world and what the medical field and how they view the world. And so I was more interested in how can we holistically, determine a person's well-being, what's going on with their, cultural psyches and processes. How can we better understand that from a more kind of the humanities, interpersonal kind of realm? And as I was volunteering in hospitals, and there was one instance where I was volunteering at the psychiatric ward, and that's where I got to see a lot of the work that was happening interpersonally, socially, this psychological models of healing and treatment. And so that really got me interested in it. And so I had a big change in my interest after I graduated college. I was like, I'm not going to go to medical school. I'm not going to apply. I'm going to actually start over and get a degree in psychology. And so I did a post-bac in psych. And I also actually was volunteering and working in a psychotherapy lab for men. And so that really opened my eyes to, okay, well, there's something different here in terms of being more specific to how we cater to different cultural identities of how psychotherapy or counseling might be helpful. And so this particular lab was focusing on men's experiences. But my question was, what about a man like me, an Asian, Korean, a heterosexual man who's really never kind of gotten into counseling or even knew about psychology before. How does that come into play? And so I really got curious into that. And, my mentors were, advising that maybe you should go get more education, in this and kind of see if your curiosities can be satiated or you could develop
Mhm.
more career in this. And so, and, I did a lot of my search, and then I found counseling psychology as a field where there was more work being done on this regard. There was a lot of social justice, multicultural focus in this field. And I got really interested and, excited about it. So that's what kind of started my journey into counseling psychology. And then once I got my master's degree, I was trying to, explore my interest as a clinician versus a researcher. But my mentors kind of also advised me that I think you have some potential in research and, going into more social scientist roles. And so that then got pushed me into more education, getting a PhD. Obviously, my parents were like, "Well, what is counseling psychology?" And they were like, "Do they call you a doctor? Like, what do they call you?" Right? And so my thing with them was like, "Yeah, I think they call you a doctor, and they do see you as a professional, and that's why that's all they needed, honestly." I think to this day they kind of still wonder about what exactly is counseling psychology and what exactly, is what I do and kind of working with clients or doing the research and teaching all that. So, but now they kind of, understand more of the work because now I'm at an institution, I'm a faculty working with, master students and doctoral students. And so they're getting around it. But that's just like a small side note about, again, this interesting, right, journey of how growing up in a household where psychology really wasn't, something that is easily talked about or even discussed. I mean, there's a lot of stigma around it too. So, but yeah, it's definitely been a personal journey too, because a lot of these steps that I took to get into this was really more about better understanding myself and in terms
Mhm.
of what's available for me in this psychological world.
Those
Yeah.
mentors that you worked with when you were working at that lab, were there any Asian American clients?
No.
Okay. Wow.
So
Huh.
that was one thing. Well, so actually, in terms of the data that we were working with the clients, we weren't sure whether they identify as men of color or such, but the content that they were talking about, I could tell. Right? They were talking about marginalized experiences, underrepresentation. So that's what kind of piqued my interest. We weren't. It was de-identified, so they didn't have information on the racial or ethnic background or cultural identities.
Uh,
But the gist, because we were looking at qualitative data, transcribed qualitative data in
mhm.
group therapy setting, and so I could tell that they were talking about things like discrimination, being overlooked, gender norm issues in their household and things, and so a lot of that spoke to me as well.
And the mentors, this is something I hear about in the literature. To have mentors who are people of color be interested and facilitate your career growth. Your mentors, were they people of color?
So initially, actually, in this lab, they weren't.
Mm,
And so at this time, I think I was more about, well, let me just find anybody in psychology who can kind of work with me. So that's how I kind of got started. And this was like 15 years ago now. And so, but that kind of started this chain where they were like, well, you can now start exploring, the different literature, who's actually doing the work that speaks to you, right?
mm,
Who's doing the work that also aligns with your lived experience. And that's how I also kind of found some of those programs in counseling psychology that fits better with me, depending on, does the faculty have, for example, representation of somebody who might be like me or who
mm, mm,
knows or understands the experiences that I go through. And so, for example, in my PhD program, I connected with an Asian male, mentor, a faculty advisor who I met at a conference, and then he eventually, that's the program that I entered, and he became my main faculty advisor. So there was a lot of yearning of
mm,
making sure that I find a mentor who connects with me, and of course, racially, ethnically, that connection is important. But I think more important that is that, do you get it, right? Do you get the experience that I've gone through? And can you understand that why it's important for me to study this further, right? Because that is what validates my experience. And so, and that's how I can validate other people who kind of experience the similar ways but have been overlooked in our society, be validated in this perspective too. So
Mhm.
that was very important for me. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, the part you're talking about being overlooked and invalidated, this is something we hear about invisible model
Mhm.
minority for that Asian men experience. Now, your work, you've gotten into online racism. How did that happen?
So this also goes back to, kind of during that journey. So it actually is a nice connection there. So this was something that I got into during my master's program. I was working with various mentors who were really big in racism research. And so, I got to really learn about racial trauma, racial microaggressions theory, and all these different frameworks that we use to understand how a racially minoritized person might be oppressed in our society. But at this time was when more and more social media presentation of racial hate was happening. So at that time, what I remember is a lot of police brutality videos against, for example, Black individuals, hate crimes against Asian individuals, other, racial minoritized individuals being victimized. And these videos and content, photos, and even discussions online.
Around what year was this?
It was around 2012 to 2013.
Okay.
Yeah. So roughly about 10 years ago. And, you know, me and my colleagues actually started talking about, well, how we're getting really stressed out about this, right? Because something
Mm,
happening that's across the country is now at our fingertip, in our phone, right? You can easily access this. People can get conveniently traumatized through social media content. So, well, what about this? Like, how are we doing anything about this? Like, how does this affect our mental health? Because we are talking about it as something that's stressing us out. So on a daily basis, is this is happening, like content is coming on every day, like sometimes multiple times throughout the day. And the other thing is that things that happened in the past suddenly now appear because of the algorithm, right? Because
mm,
there's one content talking about or representing this traumatic content, and then you keep seeing those, and then the whatever the social media platform does, their algorithm then kicks in other relevant content. That's kind of like this like the the racist content that you see online as well. So, and I think even back then, this was when there was like hardly any moderation, hardly any censoring, hardly any ways of preventing the options you see in Twitter or other social media platforms. Like, I don't want to see this anymore,
mhm,
or
mhm.
that was not that wasn't
Yeah.
present at all during back then. So people were just like, left to kind of witness all of this. And so, me and my colleagues were really talking about it on a daily basis. So I was like, let me study this, because this is something that really, affected a lot of us. And then, yeah, there's not a lot of literature on this, not a lot of interest on this. There were several, emerging scholars studying more of this issue, but it was like the field was largely, especially social science and psychology, they haven't really like gotten onto this train of, well, what about the technology, what about the social media that's changing a lot of our psychological landscapes. And this was, I think, one part of that experience too. So a lot of that was missing. So I was like, you know what, I'm really passionate about this, so let me make this my goal as I enter my PhD program. So that started everything. And in the PhD program, I decided to really create a tool that can assess how much people experience online racism, so that I can continue to study how that affects mental health issues. What are ways that we can disrupt the mental health costs associated with online racism, and eventually trying to make sure that we have more of an informed intervention that we can use. And so that's been kind of the journey with
Mm,
that research program.
yeah. Wow. So really seeing the immediate relevancy of the tools that or the media that you were accessing. I mean, this is something previous generation didn't really have. Like,
Mhm.
TikTok, Facebook, and yeah, back then when you shared a post on Facebook, everyone
Yeah,
mostly saw that you can't just say, "Oh, I don't want this."
right.
So now you mentioned online racism. How are you defining this? Because you mentioned
Mhm.
exposure to traumatic content. So I'm actually wondering, how would you define online racism?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that there is probably not one way to define it. When I set out to study this, really, there's been a lot of different ways of talking about online hate, not just racial hate, but just hate in general on the internet. So, but in my case, I kind of looked at it multidimensionally. So, on one level, it's really about, and this is something that people are probably commonly experiencing, is this interpersonal cyber aggression that you might experience on the internet. So somebody kind of, saying some racist comments to you, or sending you a racist DM or something like that. And then there's the vicarious aspect of it, which is huge on the internet because everything you see is vicarious, right? So you see a lot of these, traumatic racist content. Let's say, when we know this for sure with, for example, what happened with the COVID-19 related anti-Asian hate. A lot of, those videos got posted online. All of those Asian individuals who identify with the experience were vicariously affected by this. And social media, with the vicarious nature of it, really carried this spread really well. And then the third dimension of it is and this is one where I call it how the social media mediates, for example, a racially minoritized person to really be socialized and realize that we're living in a society with systemic inequities and, oppressive ideals. And so these are things where now we're not just interacting with people online, we're exposed to tons of information daily basis. So this is more of an information based exposure where you could be running into content that talks about systemic racism, unfairness in housing, education. You could even be encountering online racial hate groups, and because they're very mobile on the internet, and the internet is actually how they expand their reach and grow their base. You could be looking at hate crimes, contents about hate crimes, photos, videos, and all these issues conveniently through these contents. And so that all kind of is under this systemically unjust or systemic racial injustice in our society. And so, if you think about your offline racism experiences, which are more interpersonal, something that you would experience in schools, restaurants, on the street, it's not like every day you come across systemic racism experience or information. So, but when you go on the internet with the online racism experience, this is so much more convenient because it's information based. You're likely to be more exposed to. I think there's a lot of subjectivity to this, but that was one aspect of online racism that I think is more than just how we think about maybe cyberbullying, for
Mm,
example.
mm,
It's not just about race-based cyberbullying.
mm,
It's more than that. It's bigger than that. So I think that is the part where less focus has been placed.
mm. So it's not just the overt racism, like, the expletives, the vulgarity that are being spewed online. It's also the realities of acknowledging how systemic racism is impacting, say, access to resources, say, housing,
Mhm.
economic opportunities, and so forth. Okay. And are there maybe some key findings that you have discovered in your work? And one thing I really appreciate about your work too, I hope you can speak to, is I think oftentimes with racism is that we think about the victimized group,
Mhm.
how racism impacts the victimized group. We
Yeah.
rarely examine, well, racism actually affects all of us. And you actually did a
Mm,
paper on this where, wait, racism also affects emerging
mm,
adults. So I know that's kind of a two-part question, but maybe generally, what are some of the findings
Mm.
from your research, and telling us a little bit more about what you found in terms of a general impact of racism?
Yeah, and then I think this can also some of the information that I'll share can tie into kind of what you were saying about the exposure to systemic racism online, and I think that'll be integrated into this as well. But so, for example, when I developed the tool to assess online racism, we were kind of wondering, well, does this experience differ from offline experience? Like, are
Mm,
there some unique stressors that are associated with online racism that is beyond just offline racism? And so in the study that we developed this measure, yeah, we found that online racism, the stress associated with online racism is actually unique compared to offline racism. So
mm,
there's something more unique going on when people are stressed out from experiencing online racism. So all that being said, that is just one other snippet of evidence where there is something to this that we need to pay attention to. I mean, from then on, sort of, I did a lot of research in this, and actually the field studying online racial hate has been growing. There is many other people who are getting
mhm,
interested in this, and it was nice to see that my measure also getting used, by other scholars. But some of the research that I've done, it's no surprise. A lot of online racial discrimination experiences have been linked to a lot of mental health issues, depressive symptoms, anxiety, traumatic, trauma-like symptoms, substance use related coping,
mm,
suicidality, and just feeling lonely because of feeling like you're excluded based on all this content that you see online that are racially marginalizing to people that you see who you might identify with. And so all of that is no surprise. And it's been kind of jarring to see that it's it's always consistent, that this cost. And if you think about the youth, the children who grow up nowadays, who are literally socialized in digital ways, right?
mhm,
There's families, they grow up in their families and schools, but they're on their phones every day. They're on their tablets every day. So they are also being socialized so much through the internet. And this is all content that they are also exposed to. So think about how they will think about their sense of self and identity 10 or 20 years down the road when they are continuing to be socialized this way. So some of the research that I've been doing is to really try and disrupt, right, how online racism's impact could be minimized. And so we've started looking at how things like social support, what about feeling connected to an online community, finding, counter space. So we call that as sort of a space in online landscapes where, they are really critically aware of these issues and are able to validate your experiences of oppression and really help you kind of navigate some of these issues. And so all of these are proving to be helpful. And one thing that's been coming up was the critical social media literacy, is where do you have the skill to critically evaluate the content that you're exposed to? And are you also able to produce content that's critically, affirming and validating of your sense of self? And so you could, for example, you could think about content that pushes anti-racism agenda, for example. So these are to kind of combat, right, the hate that's available online. So that kind of skill set has been found to be helpful
mm.
to kind of feel less impacted by online racism. And so this seems to be a tool that's really important for people to really develop, especially in today's digital society. Now, the other side of things, as you asked about, what about racism affecting white individuals in the U.S.? Because we know that they are the people who don't experience the systemic racism or have the racial privilege in our society. So one of my and this is not a main interest of mine, but it is something that I really wanted to study because it's not just racial minority individuals being exposed to online racism. It's also white individuals, right? They see this happening.
Mm,
When we saw tons of polarizations of social media content on George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, everybody in the world got to see this, not even just US, right? And along among those populations, definitely white people in the US as well. So they got to see this. So how are they reacting to it, right? How are they feeling based on exposure to this? How does that actually help their willingness to engage in anti-racism advocacy, for example? And we looked at one study where we were looking at exposure to online contents of racism and how white emerging adults, how do they react in terms of empathy, in terms of how they see the racial dynamics, how do they react in terms of their white guilt, fragility,
mm,
right? Because that is something where white individuals might react, how they might react to when they talk about race or racism. And so and we were saying how do those elements, are there any links to anti-racism advocacy? And so there in this study, what we found was that white emerging adults who react more in terms of fear of sort of encountering contents about racism that's also tied to fragility and guilt, they're less likely to engage in anti-racism advocacy
mm,
because that is more of an internalizing feeling that kind of stopping them in their tracks kind of thing.
mm, mm.
Whereas those who are able to have more empathy, and empathy is the key, they were more likely to think about engaging in anti-racism advocacy. So what this tells us is that we need to make sure that we also tap what's going on among white individuals when they are also being exposed to a lot of this online racism content. And I think that's a huge missed opportunity. I don't think that this advantage that we have, where how social media affords us like this, is not really being taken, because a lot of things can be done through this channel. And when you start to think about how it's also affecting how white people think about themselves as they are more and more exposed to the realities of racism online, because as you might also know, a lot of white individuals choose not to be aware, choose not
Mm,
to
mhm.
really critically think about this, and choose to ignore that it's actually still a problem, right? So I think there's a lot of potential there that's just not been studied yet.
Yeah. So, part of it is, as you're saying, how much of it is the privilege of being a dominant culture and
Mm.
not looking at this, the other interaction potentially, as you were saying, the white fragility identity. I like that you're also looking at the buffering effect.
Hmm.
What are some of the things that we can do and trying to create something tangible for our listeners? Is there something that you would recommend who are trying to take more of an anti-racist approach to their work? What are some things that they can do?
With everything that's related to racism, I think the base is that all that should still count, right? Is that yes, we need to first acknowledge that it is the reality in our society, and all of that still is something that can't be glossed over. Especially, let's say you're talking about understanding your clients, background, their lived experiences, acknowledging and recognizing and validating those experiences would be really important. But as we talk about the online racism or the social media experiences, I think there is lack of research and work that is being done when it comes to how are psychologists adapting to this
Mm,
landscape.
mhm, mhm,
When clients come in talking about, oh, I receive racist comments every day and this is driving me crazy, or I'm getting just stressed out, or they're saying, oh, I don't, this is really stressful, like this is really hampering my self-esteem, this is really making me feel like I don't want to do anything. How do you respond to that, right? How do you kind of work with that experience? And the question that you should be asking yourself is that, do I know well enough about these online racism experiences? Am I critically aware that this is happening right in our backyards? And do I have the necessary tools to understand that this is not just about interpersonal experiences, because this happens through social media, through the internet. So what are some differences there that the work has to then catch on? So, and the strength that I think that we as psychologists have is that we already have foundations and models that can help with some of these symptoms, right? If somebody is experiencing depressive symptoms because of online racism experiences, obviously we have the tools to work with depressive symptoms. But what about the uniqueness of how that person continues to experience online racism experiences in social media? Because chances are just telling the person to don't use social media is not the
Yeah,
solution.
yeah. Hmm.
Just report it, telling the client to report it is not going to be the solution,
Hmm.
right? Because people have to be on social media nowadays. That's not a question. So, and the other thing is, in fact, if you're not on social media nowadays, you also lose out on a lot of the opportunities, a lot of the ways that you could develop yourself in this community or in the society. And so this goes to the fact that back then people, used to study internet addiction, but nowadays it's not about being online every day, all day. People are online every day. It's more about the problematics of the internet use, how the experiences of the internet, the social media can impair you in socially functioning ways. And so I think that as clinicians, something that we can take also is the critical literacy
Mm.
of the online experience and the social media experience. And I think that kind of translates to not just at the therapist level, but also at the client level. So, is there some congruence there in terms of how that critical literacy, the digital or the social media literacy, can be a topic that you both work
Mm.
on together,
Mm.
right? Because that can then kind of create this not just, you know, um, kind of congruence in terms of what you're talking about, but also the fact that this is something that we can normalize, that we need
Yeah.
to kind of develop this or be more aware of this. And it is that tool itself, the literacy, is not just so that it's an individual level skill that you just use for yourself. It's essentially an interpersonal skill because it
Mm.
helps to create social capital online that actually acts as a critical social support system. So you
Mm-hmm.
need to be able to find the right type of social support online, one that can actually validate your experience and have a lot of congruence in terms of your lived experiences. You don't want to be going to a website full of people with diverse ideologies on race and racism and looking for social support there, because chances are you might be encountering even more racial hate, or even more negative comments or negative content about race. And so in some of the research that we do see that. We do see that those increasing kind of, your seeking of online social support just, linearly, like just assuming that the more you do, the less mental health issues you're going to have is not necessarily true, because there's a lot more complexity that goes into finding this online community that you can really connect with. And so that process, I think, is something where therapists can be really helpful, especially for youth and emerging adults nowadays who really are kind of blurred in terms of the
Mm-hmm.
online and offline experiences. And so as a therapist, that's where the questions lie, right? Is that if you're not really critically or digitally literate yourself, or you're not as aware of some of these issues that are going on, there's going to be a disconnect, I think,
Mm.
between the
Yeah, you're
therapist.
missing an aspect of the client's identity.
Hmm.
And this really does, I think, shape the way we think about ourselves. Oftentimes therapy is done one-on-one. We have this singular
Hmm.
identity. And I think what you're proposing here is very radical in a way that,
Hmm.
oh, I also have the potential of developing this online identity,
Hmm.
and to be able to join the client in exploring and discerning what are some appropriate support groups. Because,
Right.
like you're saying, more support groups isn't necessarily the answer, being able to discern which one is actually helpful.
And this is, I
Yeah.
think, not just true in the therapeutic realm, in schools, in families, in parenting. I think this is all relevant there in today's
Mm.
society, where it's just so hard to look at both worlds with a separate eye. They're
Mm,
all kind of integrated together now. It's all
mm,
blurred. And so I think that we do have to move toward, and, we think about CBT skills or, skills that can interpersonal skills. But, have we really started to look at some of that in terms of how it is shaped within the context of social media or the internet or the technologies that serve us nowadays? And so, not just like, adapting the CBT into a computer format. That's not what I'm talking about, right? It's about the effects of the technology on the human beings, and how can we use psychological tools to help what's happening with that. So I think there has been less and less research in that, because so much of the research in social media is about, oh, let's just make our, some of our psychological tools better or disseminate them more widely using the internet or social media. But what about what social media is doing to us? And I think with the AI, all of that stuff on
mm,
the
mm,
rise,
mhm,
I think
mhm.
this is going to be a really important topic for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Was there something along your path that you learned and you just didn't expect?
I mean, I never thought I would be a psychologist. Let me say that. I think that's the biggest revelation that I had for myself. Is some days I'm like really thick into my work. I'm just running and doing my thing, and then I stop and think, wow, I'm really doing this work as a psychologist, having grown up in a household that never talked about mental health, that never talked about psychology. So what a transformation that is for myself. But I talk about that because that should not be a transformation. That should be an
Mhm,
option that should be available to a lot of us, and we should be more aware of that in our communities. And I'm not saying that in terms like Western psychological frameworks, or that necessarily that we have to have this, psychological mindset, but anything equivalent to that or relevant to that, right? The feelings, the mental health aspect of your day-to-day experiences, why were they not talked about? And why
mm,
were they kind of missing in my growing up experience? And how can we do better? And I think even with those roots, there's so much work that needs to be done in terms of how psychology is serving, racially minoritized individuals or other culturally, minoritized backgrounds. But I think at the end of the day, I feel like that transformation is a great thing for me, but there's a lot of loss
mm,
that I realized throughout that journey, that, oh, why wasn't I given this opportunity earlier? Why didn't I
mhm,
realize this earlier? Like, so, and if you think about even the discrimination experience, it wasn't until like much later in my growing up experience that I did not realize I was kind of not acknowledging that this was racism, that I was experiencing discrimination. And because somehow I was kind of socialized to not see the problem, right? Not see the
mhm,
issue, just
mhm,
do the work and be successful. So, yeah, so I think it's a very complex journey where that epiphany, like the daily epiphany that I have, is something that I think speaks to that. So, but yeah, that's a great question. I really appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for sharing all this, and your work is takes a lot of bravery to examine this. Where can listeners find you online?
We do have a research lab website, hitlab.luskin.ucla.edu. You can reach out to me via email as well. And my contact info is on the website too.
Okay, great. And I will link all that to the show notes. Again, Dr. Gome, thank you very much for your time.
All right. Thank you so much, Jack, for having me. Thank you.
A huge thank you to our listeners. If you like what you've heard, please share and subscribe to our podcast, People of Color in Psychology.